Canada is a world leader when it comes to critical minerals, and America wants in. Washington has just bought stakes in two BC-based critical mineral companies, sending their stocks soaring. The U.S. bought a 10% stake of Trilogy Metals for $35.6 million and a 5% stake in Vancouver-based Lithium Americas. Ottawa had blocked foreign investments in the Canadian critical mineral sector in the case of China, citing national security concerns. But it's not yet known how any potential American stakes will play out.
Well, and this is huge considering the fact that China just unilaterally decided to block the rest of the world from purchasing or buying any of their critical minerals, which includes, of course, lithium, a mineral that is used for electric cars, batteries, defense implements, and all kinds of stuff like that. Incredibly critical, and they're becoming more and more hostile towards the United States, which is, they view them as their main adversary, and the United States should be doing the exact same thing, because the United States' biggest enemy is not Russia, it's not Iran, it's none of these countries, it's China. And they're deliberately trying to undermine the U.S. at every single chance that they get, including with the procurement of critical minerals. And the fact that the U.S. is now moving towards securing those, it's a smart move by the Trump administration.
Was Dr. Gracelyn Bhaskaran, Director of the Critical Minerals Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, could you first please walk us through the significance of both of the Canadian mining companies that we mentioned, starting with Lithium Americas? Clearly, it's got to focus on lithium, but how significant is that to the U.S.?
You know, lithium's not actually as rare as we like to think it is. It tends to exist in a lot of places. But, you know, historically, in recent years, we've gotten the majority of our lithium from Chile and Argentina. Now, what you see with this administration is a much more targeted effort to build these capabilities onshore. And a portion of this equity, there was a 5% equity done in the Thacker Pass project, which is in Nevada. So even though we have lithium here, in the longer term, what we really want to see is a friend-shore, near-shore approach to the lithium supply chain. So even though we get a lot of our lithium from Latin America, we get about 65% of our lithium ion batteries from China. So what we want to see here in the United States is getting that lithium in North America, refining it, and then being able to manufacture our batteries so we loosen that reliance on China.
Now, we know that, as you just said, lithium-ion batteries, that's the primary move for lithium. Is there anything else that we use lithium for?
Variety of different defense technologies, energy technologies. We see it being used in electric vehicles in particular, are a huge driver of forecasted lithium demand. It really is one of those metals that in a way is industry agnostic. We need a lot of it, but we kind of take it for granted some days because it's not as rare, it's not as vulnerable to disruption as some of the other minerals that we hear more about.
Well, it's the latest move by the White House to take ownership in the mineral supply chain critical to their interests. But it's the first deal proposed for a Canadian company. Why now?
So let's start with why equity, because we're using equity in a way that is relatively unprecedented and definitely unprecedented in the resources sector. So, you know, in the era of this administration, we heard a lot about DOGE and wanting to cut our expenses early on. What this administration is looking at is a more fiscally sustainable model of providing state support. So we can take the MP Materials deal that DOD did, that $400 million of equity that the US government put into MP Materials is already worth close to $900 million, which means that the taxpayer money is getting a return. And ideally that money is turned around and reinvested into strategic projects. So given that equity allows a shareholder return, as opposed to our historical cheap financing or grants, because this administration is really holding on to this. And it's not surprising. You have a very strong private sector contingency in this administration. You have a huge financial sector contingency. So they're wired to think a little bit different than maybe a traditional Washington mentality. Why Canada? That's a great question. Obviously, I grew up on the Michigan border. I love Canada, but this administration has taken a little bit of a different, sometimes less friendly approach to Canada. But at the end of the day, there's a couple of things you have to remember. We actually do not have a lot of mining companies here in the United States. A lot of our projects here are actually mined by allied countries. So Canadian, British, Australian. So really what we're looking to do is, particularly on a commercial front, you can't rely on American companies alone. It simply won't work. So we are starting to lean into our allies. You may have seen that the Export-Import Bank recently did its first loan to Australia in resources since 2013. So we're taking our historical allies and we're deploying our instruments increasingly there, acknowledging that America can't actually do it alone.
And that's the thing that a lot of Americans ignore, particularly those who are not paying attention to what's going on in the world, is that for the amount of minerals that the United States, as the most powerful economy in the world, requires, there are simply not enough mines in the United States. Of course, part of that is with the whole, exporting and offshoring the mining industry to other countries by the Democrats under Obama, under Biden, and so on and so forth. A lot of mining towns died off, but it's also that simply there just isn't enough. The demand is so high by the American market that you just can't supply it at home. And these are finite resources. And Canada, like it or not, has some of the most abundant mines and deposits of critical rare earth minerals in the world. And to buy it from China, to continue to empower your literal enemy by buying from them and depending on them for your supply chain, would be self-destructive. It would be suicidal for the United States to continue to do that, and it wouldn't be smart. So to buy it from China, I'd much rather buy it from Canada. And then there's that whole, 51st state situation where a lot of provinces and a lot of jurisdictions in Canada are wanting to further integrate with the American economy because they understand just the power of not only the American dollar, but the American economy, particularly under a Trump presidency. You got places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, with Alberta having the third largest deposits of oil and gas in the world, and there's Saskatchewan with its potash, the place with the most potash in the entire world. So the U.S. is looking north for access to those critical minerals, and it's right there. It's just north of the border. And Trump has said it multiple times. You have this imaginary line talking about the 49th parallel, and he's trying to thin that line as much as possible economically and when it comes to the procurement of mining resources.
You said that America used to get a lot of their lithium from Chile. Who are they going to be selling to now?
That's a great question. And there's a lot of anxiety from emerging markets as to what these deals could actually mean for a long-term industry. At the end of the day, to be honest, China actually has very limited ability to buy all of that.
All right, let's move on to the other company that we mentioned, Trilogy. What's its potential significance for the U.S.?
Again, Trilogy is a company that has, it was a bit of an unexpected announcement, and partially because the announcement came during the government shutdown when we're not spending as much money right now. But again, it's a project that is really crucial to our supply chain security. And some of these companies, there's not a lot of alternatives. Remember, one of the big things about this administration is they are looking for projects that are basically shovel ready or as close to shovel ready as possible. MP Materials, one, because they are the only large scale producer of rare earths. Lithium Americas is doing pretty well with that Thacker Pass project. And it looks it's commercially viable because they already have equity from a company like GM. So for Trilogy, a lot of the outward looking in thought is kind of continuing that same trend, but there's a lot more that to be honest, that we're going to need to learn about that deal in coming days.
Well, I think everyone who's following these deals is going to learn a lot about some rare earth minerals, critical minerals that they had never heard of before. The one I want to learn from you is germanium. Apparently, this deal very significant in relation to germanium. So the question is, how so? How's germanium used, and what is germanium?
Great question. I mean, I don't know about you, but I wish some days that I paid more attention to the periodic table in 10th grade because I think about it every day now. So germanium is an interesting one because it was actually one of the first commodities that China banned exports of to the United States. This was in the summer of 2023. And it really started the weaponization of resources that we've now come to become quite familiar with. Germanium is absolutely crucial to semiconductors, and it's really hard to make a semiconductor without germanium. Now, you don't generally dig germanium out of the ground. What you do is you actually get it as a byproduct of refining other commodities. So in particular, when I refine zinc, I can get my my germanium out of that. This is why historically Canada has been a really important player here, is because even our zinc in the United States, we actually send to British Columbia for refining, and then that germanium has historically come back. Obviously, one of the difficulties we have in America, because it'd be like, well, why don't we build one here if we're in America first mentality, is that it is not economic. I always say if minerals were all the bang and rage that we say, why are we struggling to get capital moving? And a lot of that is because the economics of it aren't great. And part of that is because China has produced more and more and more. So you have a lot of supply and then demand is not keeping up with that. So that's the perfect economic equation for low prices. When it comes to zinc and being able to get that germanium out of it, zinc refining charges are pretty much negative right now. So you lose money in that process. So no company in the United States, and we've looked, right, is racing to say, well, I'm going to build a 75-year-long smelter because I'd like to operate cash negative. So really, Canada has been a very important ally, whether we feel it or not right now, in that germanium is really crucial for our semiconductor manufacturing industry.
What concerns are you hearing over both these deals, if any?
So the big one is this is a very different way of doing business, right? And a lot of these are coming top down, very high level announcements. They're not necessarily being done competitively. So you're not seeing competitive tenders. For some of them, the authorities are a little bit opaque. MP Materials, in my opinion, a great deal, but the Department of Defense authority to do it was a little bit opaque. So again, in a capitalist society, in an ideal world, it would be a public competitive tender. There would be a process for selecting these projects, and you're not necessarily seeing that. So there is I think there's an understanding that some of these tools are important, especially because they are nascent markets and nascent industries. However, what is the authority, and is this being done transparently? And to be candid, as much as I'm supportive of the public-private cooperation, it's not always transparent.
Yeah. Do you see these potential deals as the beginning of something new, as the tip of the iceberg?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's two ways to look at that. So the one is we're seeing just equity as a growing tool here in the United States. And again, it's creating an ex-China market, right? You're starting to see companies like Apple and GM prefer to sign offtake agreements with these companies because they don't want disruptions from China. And that's kind of the model that we want to see, is that eventually the price will come up because there's enough offtake from allied companies. So that's one. The second thing is we have something called the Development Finance Corporation. And historically, it was kind of like a development finance institution, limited to being able to fund things in lower and middle income countries. We in the United States created that in 2018 under President Trump's first administration. It was given a 7-year mandate, which means it's actually up for reauthorization this year. And DFC is really important to this administration. And one of the limits to that was that the way that the government could take equity in projects abroad, it wasn't scored efficiently, which created a disincentive on your to put it onto your balance sheet. Very likely you're going to see DFC be able to take equity in more projects abroad. So what you end up ultimately seeing is more equity both at home in North America, but also abroad. And when you take that in conclusion, again, you're seeing a much more active state in a sector that historically has not seen a lot of state intervention in the last 40 years.
And that all goes back to the whole Trump trying to squeeze China out of the markets, because he understands, as much as he says, I have a decent relationship with President Xi, and Trump is a personality guy, right? He's friends with a lot of people that he might also be adversaries with. A perfect example is Putin. He's actually friendly with Putin on a personal level overall, but he understands, like, dude, you know, you got to get your act together. We got to end this war, this and that. And, you know, he's able to separate on a personal level versus, I know you're my adversary and I know that you're working to undermine my economy and my country. And that's the whole thing with China, right? China coming out and deciding that they're not going to be selling critical minerals to particularly the United States, being their main target. But they also said other countries all over the world, just to save face and say, oh, we're not just targeting the United States. And that's why Trump put 100% additional punishing tariffs on China, because Trump, of course, he's not just going to sit there and let them do what they're doing. And this is an effort by the United States and by the Trump administration to become as independent from China as possible, but also to push them out of the market. The world became very dependent, a little too dependent on Chinese manufacturing and Chinese supply of raw materials when it came to semiconductors. And semiconductors are huge. They're on everything. They're in your fridge, they're in your TV, they're on your smartphone, they're in your smartphones, they're in vehicles now, they're in everything. And if China controls those, then you're giving them a power that you don't want them to have. So this is yet another move by the Trump administration to create a more powerful, more self-reliant North America, using Canada as the supplier of those resources that they're no longer going to be getting from China.
Canadians can be forgiven if they've got a little bit of whiplash in relation to our relationship with the Americans. In your opinion, should Canada be welcoming or wary of these Washington deals?
So anytime you have commercial engagement, I think it's a stronger argument for better diplomatic relations. You know, I think that it is generally quite positive that the US government is backing Canadian companies. And my hope sincerely is that this is a start of a more productive relationship between the two countries, especially because in essence, the US government part owns Canadian companies right now. So really, this should be the foundation of a much better relationship going forward. And in an ideal world, a much stronger minerals diplomacy relationship. And this has a lot of positive spin-offs. You know, sometimes we kind of get into the like, great, we're going to rely on dirt and rocks. But with that comes processing, the expansion of energy infrastructure, manufacturing capabilities. You know, we talked about lithium ion batteries at the beginning. We want to manufacture more of those here, right? So it has a lot of positive economic spin-off benefits. So my hope is that this is just the start of a better relationship.
This announcement is huge, and it goes back to, like I said before in many videos, the further integration of the North American economy to become as self-reliant as possible, to just push out China, push out the European Union, even though Canada is trying to, we got to get closer. We're the most European, non-European country with Mark Carney, but those are words. What are the actions? The United States is investing in Canadian critical mineral companies. Hey, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to be notified every time a new video is published, hit the subscribe button and activate the notifications bell. It's completely free and it helps our channel grow. A heartfelt thank you to all our channel members. I really appreciate your support. See you all in the next one. Peace.